Okay, hello everyone and welcome to the 6th event in our Circular Economy series focused on RIBA Stage 5 Construction and Manufacturing. I'm Georgie Price, a member of the ACAN Circular Economy Group, and I'll be chairing today's session. Before we start, just some quick housekeeping points. The meeting is being recorded, so to avoid any background noises, we'll keep mics muted, but we definitely want to hear from you throughout the session. So if you've got any comments or questions for our speakers, please do pop them in the chat and we'll come to them at the end of the Q&A. For those of you who aren't so familiar with ACAN, ACAN is a network of individuals within architecture and the built environment, taking action to address the twin crises of climate and ecological breakdown. We have 3 overarching aims: decarbonise now, ecological regeneration, and cultural transformation. Our growing network is formed around 9 thematic groups, as you can see here on the left. We work together to create change in many ways, including campaigning, researching, lobbying, and knowledge sharing. If you'd like to join any of these groups or simply just want to learn more, the best way to get involved is via our WhatsApp and Telegram broadcast channels, and the links to those we posted in the chat shortly. ACAN are running some live events, live campaigns at the moment. So the limit the carbon footprint of construction was launched successfully with cross-industry support. As of this morning, it's just 177 signatures away from reaching the target, so please do go take a look, sign up and spread the word. ACAN also recently assisted the Green Party in preparing this parliamentary petition on VAT reform to create a tax incentive to favour retrofit instead of demolition and new build. Again, please join and share this petition to push Parliament for action. Links to both of these will also be popped into the chat box soon. So coming to today and what it's all about, in the ACAN Circular Economy Group, we've been focusing on how circular economy principles can be applied to the UK construction industry. Our aim for this talk series is to identify opportunities, share examples, plus highlight some of the many barriers to implementing circularity in the UK context. The number of sign-ups and attendees has been pretty incredible so far, and it certainly confirms there's significant and growing interest for circularity in theory and in practice. And like us, you want to interrogate the difficulties of implementing it into our construction projects. So we found experts from across the industry to dig down into the details of how to incorporate circularity in a meaningful way at each RIBA stage from 0 to 7. And we plan to round off this series with an event focused on the idea of a new stage 8, which will close the circle with disassembly and reuse, which we hope will spark some lively debate. Tickets for upcoming events are available, so please do sign up. And if you've missed any of the series and want to catch up, they're all available on YouTube. For context for today's session, here's a quick reminder of Stage 5 taken from the RIBA Plan of Works. Stage 5 comprises the manufacturing and construction of the building and its systems, according to the construction programme and building contract. With greater uptake of off-site manufacturing, more emphasis is placed on the logistics of getting materials and large-scale components to site on time and management of the supply chain partners. The construction team takes centre stage at Stage 5. Client team and design team activities will depend on the procurement strategy and how the client decides to review construction quality, which is key as construction progresses. Stage 5 concludes with the issue of a practical completion certificate and preparation for full handover in Stage 6. So today, we're delighted to be joined by Peter Swallow. Based out of Grimshaw's London studio, Peter is currently supporting the practice and meeting its commitments to design exclusively net zero carbon ready buildings and infrastructure by 2025 and delivering socially and environmentally regenerative designs by 2030. He is actively engaged in research exploring circularity in the built environment, leading Grimshaw's contribution to the EU-funded Circuit project, focusing on upscaling circular construction in regenerative cities, and contributes regularly to the Resource Efficiency RICBE group run by the University of Cambridge's Department of Engineering. And our second speaker, Peter Kelly from ISG. Peter has worked in the construction sector for almost 20 years and is a Director of Sustainable Operations within ISG. Peter has brought his expertise in sustainability strategy formulation, measurement and delivery to ISG, along with specialist knowledge on circular economy principles in order to further strengthen the company's credentials in pursuing a resource-efficient, low-carbon future. He is now responsible for the delivery of ISG sustainability policies and strategies across ISG. Peter joined the UK Contractors Group UKCG Waste Working Group in 2010, and subsequently the government's Greening the Industry Waste Task Group in 2011, working to deliver the government's pledge to reduce waste to landfill by 50% by 2012. Peter now participates in the Green Construction Board's Resource and Waste Task Group and chairs the CIWM Construction and Demolition Waste Forum, setting the agenda for waste prevention and the implementation of circular economy principles across the construction sector in tandem with regulators and policymakers. So finally, before we hand over to our speakers, I just want to highlight we're running an interactive Miro board to carry on the conversation from each session. Any unanswered questions from the chat will be posted here and the speakers will have a chance to answer them after the event. This will form the basis of the resource we'll produce at the end of the series, so all contributions are very valuable and very welcome. We'll post a link to the chat for the Miro board in the chat now. It will be live for the next 2 weeks, so feel free to watch this session and then go and look around the Miro board when you have time. And without further ado, Peter, over to you.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to, just while I'm starting my screen up here, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. It looks like we've got a fantastic turnout, and the series to date has been informative even to myself, so I'm looking forward to contributing. Hopefully you can now see my screen. Is that coming through okay?
That's great, thanks Peter.
Thank you very much. So today I'm going to talk through some of the challenges Grimshaw have faced trying to deliver circularity, obviously during stage 5. We actually have quite a long history of implementing principles which are now sort of highly aligned with circularity throughout the practice's history. So going back to the early days of the practice when Nick formed it, Barry Terry Farrell's back in the 70s, we started to look at projects that were highly adaptable and flexible. The context at the time was resource efficiency, particularly around things like the energy crisis in the early 70s. So that was a sort of context, but that sort of thinking has sort of has come back to the fore in the work that we do, particularly in the context of the climate emergency, trying to decarbonise buildings. They're all strategies that lend themselves very well to those sorts of endeavours. So we've got a long history, and we're starting to formalise that sort of knowledge that we've gained over the decades, and we're starting to collaborate now in research projects. So I've captured 4 projects, well actually 3 projects. 2 of them are linked here, which I want to take you through, which cover design for flexibility and adaptability, adaptive reuse, design for deconstruction, and urban mining. And I'm just going to take you through the sort of lessons that we've learned and the challenges that we face. So the first project is the Herman Miller factory in Bath, which has recently been converted into the Bath School of Art and Design. Back in 2019, the building opened. And the project was really interesting from the point of view of the journey that obviously Nick has taken with this project, having worked on it originally almost 40 years ago at the beginning of the practice's inception, and really sort of seeing all of the strategies and principles around flexibility and hyper adaptability of the building actually being played out in sort of in the real world in our modern times. So Nick was very sort of involved in this project with Bath Spa, actually helping to sort of guide them through the process of adapting the building. And one of the first challenges we faced, which wasn't necessarily a construction challenge, but it was a challenge to actually getting the project even off the ground, was the what he deemed the believability gap. So this was actually convincing the client that this building was the right building for them, and it was actually going to enhance what the school was trying to achieve, as opposed to sort of becoming a barrier to what they wanted to do. So he really took them back to sort of the first principles of the Herman Miller factory when he was working with the client there to develop the brief. And Nick sort of was quoted back in 1977 saying the industrial buildings can no longer be designed as monuments for special purposes. They must respond to the ebbs and flows of processes and be easily changed by their users without professional help. And you can see some rather sort of kitsch images here of guys in flares back in the 1970s taking panels off of the facade of the Herman Miller building over a cup of tea, just to sort of demonstrate the simplicity of the systems involved and the process of taking panels off and swapping them around at the time. So that was really sort of what the client needed to hear in order to sort of be convinced that this was the scheme for them and this was the building for them to develop. So we've retained the entirety of the structure of the building with some modifications. The primary structure is made of steel. We've elevated the roof using steel trusses that follow the same grid spacing as the original structure. This has allowed us to do a number of things. We've been able to create a service zone, which services an upper deck. Originally, the Herman Miller building was used primarily as a large double height space with sort of offices inserted around the perimeter. This allowed the school to create an actual complete first floor. And by elevating the roof, we've been able to get daylight servicing all provided from above into this deep plan building. And that's really helped us to retain the future flexibility of the scheme going on into the next sort of 30 to 40 years, even longer. And that was something that was really key to the design of the Bath School of Art and Design, was making sure we retained that original premise of the Herman Miller building, which was to maximise the flexibility. One of the other things that was challenging with the scheme, it wasn't quite large enough to accommodate the School of Art and Design. So there was a need for a pavilion to be put on the top of the building for lecture theatres and some larger collaborative spaces. In order to achieve this, we decided, rather than trying to sort of interface between the old and the new structure, to completely separate them. So the pavilion is completely self-supporting. It has a truss structure that then penetrates through the roof and goes down into the slab. And then we've locally created new pad foundations in order to support this deck. So that simplifies things greatly, in so much as the only interface between the old and the new building is a deflection head that runs along the base of the curtain wall, where the roof deck meets the curtain wall. So that obviously, in terms of challenges, in terms of practicality, that's something that really helped drive an efficient solution for the building. In terms of the envelope of the building, the scheme had actually been listed prior to the school actually acquiring the building, and that in itself, as a Grade 2 listing, brought some challenges to the project in trying to keep to the original sort of aesthetic of the building, and working closely with the planners and with the Heritage Board to make sure that we did everything to the building for the needs of the school would still reflect the original aesthetic of the building. So this was something that involved a lot of forensic analysis of the facade panels, making sure that we categorised them, left those which could be left in place sort of essentially untouched, and then identifying those that were most in need of repair. These panels themselves are GRP panels with an integrated foam core. They're fitted into the curtain wall system in such a way that they can be taken out and you can swap them for window panels. The idea was that Herman Miller could make modifications and move perimeter spaces around as they saw fit. And that's something that the university wanted to retain as a functionality and actually wanted to implement. So Nick spoke directly with the planners and with those involved in administering the heritage of the scheme to look at ways to mitigate any sort of negative impacts that might have come out of the new design. So there was also an opportunity there to look at enhancing the thermal performance and the visual performance of the system. You can see the details here. We've got an existing cutaway section, plan section of the steel support mullions and glazing capture system, and you can see then below that the modifications that have been made. We were able to, by working with our facade engineer, actually retain the same profile for the glazing capture system and accommodate a double glazed unit in lieu of the single pane that had been installed originally for the scheme. We were also then able to connect an internal lining that could be modified to be an acoustic panel, a pin board, or a ply sheet flexibility internally for the scheme. And in so doing that, we were able to then upgrade the thermal performance of those solid panels as well by integrating insulation behind the GRP panels. But in doing all of this, we've still retained the ability to disassemble and demount these internal panels and external panels. So there's still the ability for the school to move windows and solid panels around. And there's scope as well internally to be able to change the lining to suit the purposes going on behind the facade. There's a note here in terms of missed opportunities. There were conversations around whether the framing system GRP panels and the gaskets, maybe there should have been a complete upgrade. But I think the balance was struck, particularly in terms of, in light of it being a heritage scheme, that we managed to address the balance in keeping the original scheme, swapping out what was absolutely necessary, and finding that balance was, I think, essential to the success of the scheme. So just to conclude on the Bath School of Art and Design, in terms of the digital information that we provided at the end of construction and handover, obviously before the school took on the project, there were only archival drawings that were hand drawn. So we've provided a digital model to the facilities team at the university, along with digital scans of all of the original building elements. And although this wasn't to BIM level 2 compliance, that wasn't a requirement of the scheme, but there is certainly enough information here organised in such a fashion that it would be very easy to convert this into a sort of digital twin for the building at a later date. So that concludes the Bath School. Moving on to the civil engineering building. This project commenced in 2015 with our commission to develop a master plan to move the engineering department at Cambridge University over to a new site. The Department of Engineering were very active in developing a brief for the project. They were very keen to develop their own sustainability agenda. And two of the points I've sort of highlighted here within that are minimising whole life energy and maximising flexibility and adaptability. And that was both across the master plan, because they didn't have a programme for actually delivering all of the phases of the building at that point in time. So they needed flexibility depending on when finances came in. But also that flexibility is intrinsic in sort of developing strategies such as design for deconstruction, and that plays into ultimately reducing whole life energy within the building and whole life carbon. So those sort of had an interplay between them. So the strategies for the building that we looked at to implement were, first of all, lean construction through a modularized approach to developing the planning grid and the structural grid for the building, so that we had as many similar components as possible. We minimized the number of special components that needed to be fabricated, and we indeed minimized the need for fabricating bespoke components. We also looked at trying to increase upfront the amount of penetrations that were placed within the structure, so that we didn't have to come back at a later date and put future penetrations in. So we tried to coordinate as much of the MEP services with the and future need for MEP as the building grew. The diagram at the top right hand corner there, you can see a diagram showing a potential strategy for the building growing over time. One of the things we implemented early on in the layout of the building was to put the service calls, the stairs, the toilets and risers to the gable ends of the building in order to help minimise disruption in the future when future phases came online. So by doing that, and also by making sure that the gable end facades were a simple rain screen cassette system that could be demounted, stored, and then potentially re-installed on future phases of the building, we were really looking to sort of maximise the interplay between sort of design for deconstruction thinking and flexibility in one strategy. We also then looked initially at trying to maximise design for deconstruction across the entire project. So we actually looked at having a completely demountable primary steel structure and floor slab. We worked with our structural engineers, Max Fordham's based in Cambridge, and initially we worked through a solution whereby we had a bespoke precast concrete slab with bolted connections back to the frame and also to create rigidity between the slabs. We initially had good feedback when we approached the market. We identified that we needed to approach them early on in order to get their engagement. But when the project was tendered and the contractor came on board with their team and they started to really sort of interrogate the market, we realised quite quickly that the market wasn't really in a position or had the appetite to want to take on bespoke precast planks. So instead, we decided to shift our focus away to a more standard precast hollow core plank solution, but really then focusing on the detailing of the steel frame in order to maximise the potential for design for deconstruction of the steel frame itself. So we looked at ensuring that bolted connections between columns and beams were easily accessible and weren't coated with intermittent paint or other coatings that would inhibit the ability to debolt them. Instead, we opted for infill panels of fireboard or acoustic boarding, depending on the acoustic and fire requirements of the different subdivisions between rooms in the building. By using that strategy, we managed to make it as easy as possible to deconstruct the beams from the columns. We also looked at where the interfaces were between the hollow core planks and the structure itself, opportunities for, again, debolting those connections from the beams so that we could, again, get access and keep the steel intact to maximise the amount of steel that could be retained. I think the numbers are something around 140 tonnes of steel constitute the primary structure, which is about 50% of the total steel in the building, if you account for rebar in the concrete in the slab. So there's a huge potential there for reuse, and obviously then that's a residual asset within the building that can be accounted for within our carbon accounting. And you can see here just the final detail showing some forethought around connection details within the slab to the column bases, making sure again that it's easy to break away the screed so that you can get access to the bolts. And just as a final point, all of this is sort of meaningless if you don't have sufficient documentation and retained knowledge within the client body to be able to implement any of these strategies that we've built into the construction. So we looked at initially tagging all of the steel work with data from the BIM model. The project's working to a BIM level 2 compliance. That didn't actually make it into the final scheme, but we did have a comprehensive write-up by Rambols, who were looking to create a handover document to the client so they understood all of the strategies and all the connection requirements and limitations of the scheme that they could work with in the future. We couldn't take all of those things forward, but there are many people that are based within the building. There's the UK Collaboratorium for Research into Infrastructure in Cities, who actually were the catalyst for the building's finances, and the department itself, who is obviously an owner-occupier. They have a real desire to sort of take this forward as a living laboratory and trying to see all of these things that we've implemented seen through to fruition. So we're still working with them even after handover. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to move on very quickly just to wrap up. The last project I wanted to talk about was the Circuit project, which is the Circular Construction in Regenerative Cities R&D project funded by the EU, which we are a member of, working with RIBA London, which was formerly LWARB, BRE, Green Building Council and Greater London Authority. We're a collaborative group working with 4 other cities across the EU. We're really looking at specifically urban mining of materials within the city, flexible construction in terms of design for deconstruction, and looking at extending life cycles, so this is adaptive reuse and retrofit. Those are sort of components that are identified as key work packages to develop demonstrator projects in order to demonstrate to the market and demonstrate to potential clients that these were things that could be implemented within their projects. One particular project that I just wanted to highlight before I finish is a timber reuse project, which is a demonstrator within the Circuit project. This is where we're sort of rolling our sleeves up and actually getting our hands dirty to actually demonstrate ourselves to the supply chain that you can actually take secondary timber from a demolition site. And you can see here one of my colleagues, Annabelle, in the office, is collecting timber from her site, then going through and testing that timber, sorting it into different grades. That timber is then going to be sent to a fabricator in Devon, who's going to complete a glulam beam and column configuration, send that to the BRE to then be tested in their lab to test it and certify it for use on a construction site. So by doing that, we're really pleased to be involved in a project where we can actually demonstrate to the supply chain that these things are possible. So I'll end there. If you want more information about Circuit on our website, there's lots of workshops coming over the next couple of years where we're disseminating all this knowledge and lessons that we've learned. Thank you very much, and apologies for slightly overrunning.
That's great, Peter. Thank you so much. It's brilliant to see the longevity of some of those ideas and principles, and obviously the current examples too. That's really exciting to see. Next up, we have Peter Kelly, and just while Peter's getting his screen and slides up, we're going to post a short poll. If you have a few seconds to answer, that'd be great. It's anonymous, and it's just so we can gather some more information about our audience. And just waiting for the slides to appear. Here we go. Fantastic. Peter, over to you.
Lovely. Wow, how do I follow that? That was excellent, Peter. Really good, really interesting. So I'm going to take it slightly different tact and focus on some examples that we're actually implementing at the minute on a live construction project. But before I do that, I thought I'd just briefly give you an overview of what we're doing at ISG and how we're tackling our approach to the circular economy. I can't actually see the slides because the poll is in the way, but I can guess what's there. So we've defined what the circular economy is for our business, and that's looking at how we're going to change the way, obviously depending on what contract type we are, that we design, procure and install products, systems and materials so that they can be reused, repurposed and recycled at the highest value without causing adverse environmental impacts at cost neutral or less. So that's what we're trying to achieve in the coming months and years at ISG. And this next slide, please, really ties into our approach on net zero carbon. And you can see here that number 5 is our approach in terms of tying in with those other design standards and design issues that we think form the core of what a building should be designed to when we're trying to achieve net zero carbon. So a fundamental element of the carbon agenda as well. Next slide, please. So this to just give you a brief overview of our timeline, and you referring back to our definition, you can see that we're taking that slightly further and referring to a lot of the things that Peter's discussed. Design for manufacturing, assembly and disassembly. We must make sure we get the D in there. That's often missed and often discounted. So if we can design something to be assembled, we should be able to design it to be disassembled. We've got materials passports that we're trying to develop. We've got a really good reuse strategy going, which we're going to come on to talk about now in a minute. And then again, I think we can learn a lot from what Peter's talked about earlier around those issues of designing for longevity, adaptation, flexibility, etc. So it's great that there's so much really good case studies out there already that we can look at and try and adapt. Next slide, please. So the building I'm going to talk about, you may have heard of, has been publicised very recently, which is the Entopia Building. Funnily enough, again, for the Cambridge University, for the Cambridge Institute of Sustainability Leadership. So this is going to be their new home. It's number 1 Regent Street in Cambridge. It's a 1920s former telephone exchange, and the previous tenant was the Cambridge Assessment Centre. So we've literally on site at the minute. It's going to stay obviously as an office block, but it's going to be obviously highly sustainable. So we're going for ENAFIT. It should be the largest office structure that's converted into an ENAFIT building. It's going to be BREEAM Outstanding, WELL Gold with an aspiration for Platinum. We've got bio-based targets, we've got embodied carbon targets, and of course, what I'm going to come on to talk about, options for adapting and implementing circular economy principles. So next slide, please. So the first thing I'm going to take you through is the lighting. So we had a project at ISG, which is a Cat A fit out for a client, Sinvin, in St James's Square in London. And you can see on the left there, one of my colleagues taking some pictures of the lights in situ. The client was very keen to make sure that that Cat A strip out didn't end up in a skip. And they tasked us specifically with looking for options for reuse. And this obviously was perfect timing with this project in stage 3 design at the time. we could carefully take down those LED lights. They're in storage at the minute, and they'll be transported to Specials Lighting, the original manufacturer. They will retest those lights and re-warranty them for 3 years. They're actually going to add some LED uplighting and sort out the way in which they'll be fixed to the soffit. So this all came about through me simply getting contact details from Specials through our supply chain, giving the managing director a call, talking him through these ideas, and he was more than happy to say, yes, this is perfectly acceptable, easy for us to do. All you have to do is get us back the lights. As I said, he will test them, re-warranty them, and they're ready for installation by our contractor at Cambridge. On the right, you can see some of the ceiling panels and grids that came out of that project in Sinvin that went up to Norwich via one of our circular economy partners, Collect Eco. They're a company that take large amounts of materials off our strip out projects, and they find secondary homes for them. So a really, really great opportunity there arose. We took advantage of it, and roughly 366 of those strip lighting will now be installed in Cambridge in the coming months. Next slide, please. So the next thing we've been looking at is the electrical equipment. So we were lucky in that a lot of the electrical equipment on this project was very good condition, had been very well maintained, and that's allowed us to retain and repurpose as much of it as possible. So in these instances, you can see the lift is going to be totally refurbished, the power factor correction unit and the main electrical panel will be retested and retained for reuse. There's also obviously a lot of cabling, etc., that's already running around the building that we're going to test and retain. This is a really great example of a client that's willing to listen to the experts to say there really isn't anything wrong with this equipment. As I said, it's been really well maintained, really well looked after, it's good quality kit, and there's no reason why it should be replaced. Next slide, please. So we've also got a PV canopy up on the roof, and unbeknownst to the client, through the UK GBC, we've known Cleveland Steel for some time now. So I contacted Roy Fishwick and I said, we've got this PV canopy up on the roof. Have you got any steel that might work? And of course he said, no problem at all, Pete. I can if you give me enough time, I can find the steel that will work for this PV canopy. And you can see on the right some rusty looking steel lying around there on the ground. That steel actually hasn't been used. It's a bit dinged and dented from being moved about a bit with forklift trucks, etc., and was heading for the scrapyard. But if anyone's aware at the minute, the cost of steel is pretty high. So we've agreed that that steel will be reclaimed, it will be shot blasted and galvanized and used on the PV canopy. So we are estimating up to 90% of that PV canopy will now be reused steel, and obviously that will really help to contribute towards that embodied carbon that we've got to meet on PC. Next slide, please. So I thought I'd leave the best to last in terms of an architectural audience. I'm not sure if there's anyone here from PSE & Co, but we're currently about to start the refurbishment and fit out of 30 Berners Street in central London for Netflix. Netflix will be their new headquarters. Unfortunately, they're redesigning the reception area and don't have any use for the reception desk. And this particular reception desk was designed by PSE & Co. It has very beautiful leatherwork that was designed and installed by Bill Amberg Studio, and it was installed by Benchmark Joinery. So we've currently got Benchmark on one of our projects in London. So I contacted them and said, can you meet me on site? We need an opportunity to look at this beautiful reception desk and see how we might repurpose it at Cambridge. So we met last week. Luckily, the design is quite straightforward in terms of the carcassing. The only real issue will be the stone top, which comes in 2 large pieces and has been glued to the structure. So we have to see how that will come apart when we try and get it off. If it does break, then Benchmark have priced to provide the same oak timber as a worktop to match in with the existing structure. But hopefully it'll work. Obviously, a very beautiful piece of stonework has come from Italy, and hopefully it will all work together. Benchmark are also going to contact Bill Amberg Studios and figure out how best to clean the leather and get it back to as good as quality as it can be. But yeah, really delighted that we can save this quite beautiful piece of architecture for reuse up at Cambridge. And of course, Cambridge themselves are delighted also to have the opportunity to reinstall this beautiful reception desk. So next slide, please. I just wanted to finish off by saying one of the things that's so important with circular economy is making sure that you collaborate. We can't do this by ourselves, and I think Peter made that point too, with the amount of different consultants and different teams you have to work with to make this right. From a construction perspective, we've got your manufacturers that are often doing take-back schemes now that we work quite hand in glove with. There are lots of different circular economy partners that we use to try and reuse as many of the furniture, the light fittings, the raised access floor, you name it. When we go into a Cat B office to refurbish it, we try and make sure that as much of that material is reused. In particular, Whitecroft and Signify are doing some really great stuff around the circular economy, 3D printed lighting, and Whitecroft with their ability to remanufacture, regardless of the original manufacturer, they can usually match in their product into existing lighting systems to allow for those to be re-upgraded in the future. And then really on site, we try and, again, make sure that as much of our materials go back in terms of those packaging elements, and then what can't be goes off to local charities where they can be reused. So that's it from me. Just a very whistle-stop tour of that particular project, and I'd welcome any questions. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Peter. That was a really engaging talk and really interesting to see the opportunities that you have in just one project, and obviously the network that you're drawing on to help achieve that. It's great. So for both Peters, I've got a couple of questions here in the chat that I'll put forward to you. So the first comes from James. In the reuse of materials, just how much of an issue is the storage of reclaimed architectural salvage going to become? Are there any firms specializing in this function yet? How are details of items stored, recorded and shared? And finally, could this become a searchable database in the future too?
Yeah, a great question, and a real challenge for the industry is supply and demand. There are so many instances of materials that are ready for reuse without the right person that needs them at that time. So storage is a huge issue. We're trying to overcome that at present by using our waste management contractors, and that might seem like an oxymoron, but a lot of them do have a lot of storage space and a lot of sheds. So we're working with Multi-Services Kent, MSK at the minute. They've got a lot of storage space, and they're taking things like raised access floor back for us already. Carpet tiles is another one for reuse, either in our own projects or onto other projects or onto third parties. So definitely a problem, something that DEFRA are aware of, that we've highlighted on many occasions, that the storage, the classification, and the knowledge of what's available for reuse is a hindrance to the circular economy. I think, again, it's just going to have to be working in partnership with other contractors, other design companies to potentially club together, work with our waste contractors, find storage space, and get moving.
Brilliant. Yeah, completely agree with that shared and integrated approach. Peter, Swallow, anything to add to that one?
Yeah, no, I'd just say that I didn't get time to mention it, but the circuit projects are trying to address that as well by developing an online platform for essentially cataloguing materials and helping to sort of deliver just in time to avoid the need for storage, although it's inevitable we're going to need storage. And we're struggling with that at the moment. The project I showed with the timber, we're struggling to find some space in our office, even to just do that small demonstrator.
Yeah, a key challenge. Okay, moving on to the next one, and it's more around sort of the time needed. So how much time / resources do you allocate to reusing materials from demolition and identifying recipients? And when is this factored into the project, or is it still quite last minute during construction?
Well, I would like to take that back a bit, one step further. And one thing I say to a lot of our clients is that they should know what's in their building before they come to refurbish or refit out that space. And this is, again, something that we've discussed at length, is that there should be materials as banks. You know, we should know in those buildings what materials already exist long before it comes to refurbishment and fit out. And if clients had that kind of inventory available to hand, it would make the whole construction process a lot smoother, because you know what was there already there, you could know what opportunities were for reuse, and you could factor that into the program. Because I agree, at the minute, a lot of it is a little bit last minute. We've been very lucky at Cambridge in that we've had plenty of time from stage 3 to design in as much circularity as possible and find materials that happen to be available in the right timeframes. So yeah, I would challenge our clients or those that own buildings and do some inventories and find out what's in their buildings to begin with, and that should help when it comes to refurbishing that space in the future.
Yeah, and I'd just add to that that things like pre-demolition audits are essential to that sort of work being done, and for clients to understand what their sort of assets are in terms of materials. It's something that's not mandated, although the London plan is bringing that through as a requirement. I know the BRE are looking to develop a more holistic approach to doing those sorts of surveys as well, to make them more accessible. So hopefully that will help in that regard, and then we'll understand the bigger picture in terms of mapping material flows across the city. Yeah,
absolutely. Knowledge is power. We've got a waste is not waste, it's only material without information, right? So yeah, absolutely. A question to both of you, maybe Peter, whichever Peter wants to go first. What can architects learn from contractors, and contractors learn from architects about waste reduction and circularity? Do you see any skills that are missing in terms of design, detailing and construction?
Good question. So I'll start maybe. I think we learnt a lot on the civil engineering building, working with our contractor, just to understand what the sort of the middle ground is between our aspirations and what can be achieved within the sort of time constraints that projects have. Often there isn't the time to develop things and get your supply chain on board to make sort of even sort of minor adjustments to standard practice. So if you have them on early and you have that engagement early, you're more likely to get a positive outcome.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, I think I've learned a lot this morning from what Peter's presented. So I think the more collaboration that goes on, the more upskilling will go on, and the more we'll both be able to learn what each other's barriers are to make sure that these design principles are implemented as soon as possible, really, and as much as possible.
Yeah, I think the other thing I'd add is, though myself and Peter have actually never worked together, we've both worked for University of Cambridge, and having a client who has the foresight to try and implement these things is also, it's probably the key before we even get to meet each other. The client having that vision as well and seeing it through is key as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, I totally agree. Like, if you've got to have a client. It's really made our eyes open to what the art of the possible is on this project, with having a client that's willing to listen to the ideas that you bring to the table. And I think you made another great point, that they have to stay the course. And that's one thing that obviously the Institute of Sustainability Leadership haven't deviated one iota from their original sustainability aspirations. And that's made sure that everybody's almost towed the line in terms of making it work.
That's really interesting, yeah. And maybe just to expand on that a little bit, another question, how do you see a shift to circular construction will change or impact your long-term engagement with construction projects or with clients, noting sort of 20 or 30-year life cycles or more immediate short-term fit-out cycles, and how our roles will change?
I suppose I would think that the industry probably needs to move towards a more manufacturing, more long-term, and that would reduce the amount of construction and hopefully therefore the amount of waste on site, and that would therefore allow this deconstruction to be designed in. How we do that and tackle all the other elements around carbon and short life cycles for fit outs is another question, but that's the way I probably see the industry going, is to a manufactured approach. I don't know if you agree, Peter.
Yeah, no, I think it's essential. Dealing with both the waste sort of upstream, and then dealing with the like you say, if you can design it for assembly, it's inherently disassemblable as well. So I think that is a key component to it. Absolutely.
Brilliant. Okay, and just coming to the end now, so I've got one final question for you both. If you could change one thing about the construction process to unlock circularity, what would it be? Peter Swallow, if you want to go first.
We're going to say the easy answer, change the whole system, but that's too easy an answer. I think from my perspective, I'm really starting to see big potential around ownership models. So it's like the take back schemes, but sort of amplifying that even further, going as far as maybe, steel companies owning all the steel in every building, and using technology like blockchain technology and other things like that. They're sort of probably a decade away from maturity to really start to embed that possibility.
Sure, yeah. Peter,
for me, it's about understanding. So, we both, Peter and I, have been through a couple of examples where we've had to, I'm sure, cajole and make people understand what we're trying to achieve. And when you do, it's amazing how people get on board. The structural engineer for the PV canopy worked on the changes required over the weekend because he wanted to get this done and he wanted to contribute to the story of the building. So if we can really get the message out there and that understanding of what the circular economy is throughout the construction industry, then I think that will really help unlock and get some more circularity into our buildings.
Brilliant. Stronger networks. Sounds very good. Thank you both very much indeed. That's just about all we have time for today. Apologies if you've asked a question and we haven't come to it yet. It will be posted onto the Miro board, and our speakers will be able to go and pick up those questions, and the conversation will follow there. The next event in our Circular Economy series will be looking at RIBA Stage 6 on the 8th of April. We'll be focusing on how circular economy principles can be established with the handover stage. And we've got a great lineup, including Medasta, who are leading the field on passports, material passports. In the meantime, there are many other industry-wide events going on between now and then. And so just to highlight a couple, New York Circular City Week is on until the 28th and has some great events. And there is also the AJ Summit today in association with AJ's Retrofit First campaign with some great topics and speakers. And so finally, a really big thank you to both of our Peters for a wonderful session. That was really engaging. Thank you. And for your insights. To the ACAN team behind the scenes, and for all of you attendees, thanks for joining, and I hope you all have a great afternoon.